Women's World Cup is on, so we got yellow and red cards. Yellow means you got 5 minutes left, so red means you got 1 minute left. I don't have a black card. I will come and take your microphone away, because it's 10 minutes total per speaker. And I'm told to rigorously enforce. And I have a Teutonic background, so rigorous is rigorous.
Okay.
Be very brutal.
Okay, so thank you for being here with us today. This is the third of our Grand Challenge sessions, titled Syria's Statelessness Landscape, 8 years on. We would like to begin all of our Grand Challenges by remembering the many millions of people that we have gathered here on behalf of, several of those who are not permitted to travel with us to here today. So may I ask you please to set aside your phones and connect your hearts and minds with not just the complex issues of statelessness, but stateless people. We read to you the words of Yusuf Kwasme. What makes a camp a camp? And what is the beginning of a camp, if there is any? And do camps exist in order to die, or exist forever? The camp is never the same, albeit with roughly the same area. New faces, new dialects, narrower alleys, newly constructed and ever-expanding thresholds and doorsteps, intertwined clothing lines and electrical cables, well-shielded balconies, little oxygen and impenetrable silences are all amassed in this space. The shibboleth has never been clearer and more poignant than it is now. Refugees ask other refugees, who are we to come to you, and who are you to come to us? Nobody answers. Palestinians, Syrians, Iraqis, Kurds share the camp, the same different camp, the camp of a camp. They all have come to re-originate the beginning with their own hands and feet. Now, in the camp, there are more mosques, more houses of God, while people continue to come and go like the calls of prayer emanating at slightly varied times from all these mosques, supplementing, interrupting, transmuting and augmenting the voice and the noise simultaneously. Badawi is a camp that lives and dies in our sight. It is destined to remain, not necessarily as itself, so long as time continues to be killed in its corners. Thank you.
Good afternoon and welcome to this panel. My name is Sabine Nelke. I'm the Ambassador of Canada here in the Netherlands. The subject of today's panel requires little introduction. 8 years on, the humanitarian impact of the crisis in Syria is still dire and, to all intents and purposes, getting worse. Despite a reduction in active fighting, large-scale population movement remains, and around 6 million Syrians are now forced to live as refugees in neighboring countries or have sought refuge in Europe or in Canada. In addition to the raw humanitarian impact, this raises the problem of statelessness, particularly as it applies to the children of refugees. And the reason for that is, as you probably know, Syria's national law passes citizenship on down to children only through their legal father, not their mother. As this discussion will touch on, for a number of obvious reasons, many of the displaced children born outside of Syria in the past 8 years have, as a result, come into this world without having a state of nationality. Parents often don't have the paperwork to prove who is the legal father with a connection to Syria. And that's simple. People fleeing for their lives with their children in their arms don't have time to pick up a manila envelope with paperwork on their way out. Or the father may have been killed or fled the country. The child may have been conceived as a result of an act of sexual violence. In all cases, it might be difficult to prove a Syrian paternity and result in a child being born stateless. Now, Canada has welcomed some 64,000 Syrian refugees since November 2015 and has committed over $3.5 billion over 5 years in military, security stabilization, humanitarian and development assistance to the region in response to the crisis. But statelessness isn't a problem that you can throw money at. It's a problem that has to be resolved through law and other methods. It's a legal problem with a humanitarian and human impact. And I look very much forward to hearing from our speakers today as to how we can address this issue. Reminder to you in the audience, there are hashtags and handles up there, I think. No, they're not right now. Well, eventually they'll pop on. If you haven't seen them already, please participate actively on social media. Now, I'd like to introduce to you the speakers in the order in which they will make their presentations. We have Fateh Azam on the far left here. He's a researcher and consultant focused on human rights in the Arab region. He's an executive member of the Boston Consortium for Arab Region Studies and a member of the ISI Advisory Council. Fateh will give us a bit of the landscape of the issue today so that and set us the context for the discussion. Next will be Haki Bahram. Haki is a PhD student at the Institute for Research on Migration, Ethnicity and Society at Linköping University in Sweden. His research is focused on the legacy of statelessness in relation to forced migration and identity formation. In this panel, he'll present an overview of his current research on the legacy of statelessness as experienced by Syria's Kurdish population. Then we have Martin Clutterbuck. Martin, he's Middle East Regional Advisor for the Norwegian Refugee Council's Legal Assistance Programs, which has operations in Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Libya, Palestine, and Syria. He'll present on practical challenges and obstacles faced by Syrian refugees in obtaining legal identity documentation. Then we have Bernadette Habib. She is a senior legal officer at Frontiers Ruwad Association, a Lebanese NGO working on human rights issues with particular focus on statelessness and migration. And Bernadette will speak about the changing law and policy environment in Lebanon as a result of the crisis in Syria. And then last but not least, we have Thomas Magee. He is a PhD student at the recently launched Peter McMullen Center on Statelessness at the University of Melbourne. He'll be presenting findings on the experiences of stateless Syrians, particularly Kurds and Palestinians, within the European asylum context. And with that, you've heard enough of me, and I will give the floor to our first speaker, Fateh.
Thank you. Just to reiterate from this opening panel's discussion, clearly there are not many short people in the Netherlands. But
I joke, I make that all the time.
what I hope to do in my 10 minutes is just to give a very broad framing of the issues of the statelessness landscape in Syria. And I'll do that pretty much in bullet forms, very briefly. And my colleagues on the panel will get into a lot more of the detail. But to see the big picture can be a little bit frightening by itself. Because Syria, in a way, is a microcosm of every dynamic that affects citizenship and statelessness in the region as a whole and probably globally as well. It raises large questions that apply to the region and beyond. One is, of course, gender equality or gender inequality, that I should say. The question of revocation of citizenship is there as well. The question of categorizations of legal status that define different levels and sets of rights that you can have. The effects of war and conflict on the issue of citizenship and the exercise of citizenship and on the creation of statelessness. And then finally, and I think this is a big elephant in the room, really, I think for the issues we're discussing in these few days, is what does citizenship actually mean and the extent of the ability to exercise the rights of citizenship in the context of not only war and conflict, but ongoing systematic and gross violations of human rights in any particular country. So I'll go over these very briefly. The question of gender equality is, of course, a big one. I should always say gender inequality. like other nationality laws in the region, most of the countries in the region, women cannot pass nationality to their children. The nationality law of 1953, like other laws in the region, except for maybe 5 of the states in the Middle East and North Africa, does not permit that. It adopts a patrilineal inheritance of citizenship only. Even though Syria is a party to the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, but like most other countries in the region, it has made a reservation to Article 9.2 that exempts it from, Article 9.2 that says, women have the right to pass nationality to their children. Syria has reserved on that as well. And even though there has been some incremental progress in terms of women's rights in Syria, there have been amendments to the personal status laws. Most recent one, just I think February in 2019, that have brought some improvements in terms of personal status and in terms of violence against women, but not in terms of the right to pass nationality. As in most countries of the region, it is easier for a foundling or a child born out of wedlock with unknown parentage to become a citizen of Syria than it is for the child of a Syrian mother and a non-Syrian father. The other question, which is large, is the question of withdrawal of citizenship, and we have at least a couple of panelists who will discuss this. We know, for example, that in the 60s, Syria revoked the citizenship of, at that time, around 120,000 Kurds in the north, saying, well, these are not really Syrian, they're really Turks, or Turkish origin, or they don't belong in Syria. That number, because the status of statelessness is inherited by the children, became up to something around 350,000 stateless persons, stateless Kurds in the 2000s. Now, we also know that in 2011, the decree, I think it was Decree 49 in 2011, that opened the door for Syrian Kurds to, certain Syrian Kurds to apply for citizenship. The end result really is of these kinds of measures is that you have several categories of citizenship now. You've got, or of residence, if you will, or of legal status. You've got ajanib, which means they're foreigners, got nothing to do with them. You've got maktoum al-qaid, which also exists in other countries like Lebanon, for example, which basically means, they're registered, but they're not really one of us. We don't know who they are, but we're not going to get into exactly, not going to go so far as to give them citizenship or citizenship rights. And of course, you have the statelessness, the entire statelessness as a legal status. The big question also that looms is the suspended citizenship status of refugees. And in some ways, you can even apply that to the IDPs. But let's talk about the refugees, which is a crucial issue. Syrian refugees stuck in the camps in Turkey and in Jordan, and in encampments in Lebanon, it's not likely that many of them will be able to return, and certainly the vast majority of them will not be granted asylum, either there or in third countries, like in Europe. So they're going to end up living in a state of suspended animation, if you will. They have to stay alive somehow, but they cannot access any of the services of their country, any of the protection of the state of Syria, their country of origin, nor the services of that state, like birth registrations, passport renewals, the whole panoply of services one expects from one state. They cannot also go back in safety and dignity, and we know that for many of them, having been part of an opposition or just the fact that they fled can be a stigma attached to them, and they would be afraid to return in safety and in dignity to their homes. We don't really know totally the numbers who are or will soon end up be in such a state of limbo. Yes, we're talking about 6 million refugees. Does that mean 5 minutes? Oh, good. But there's a lot we don't know yet about this population and what their legal status in the longer term is going to be. The added population to all of this are the Palestinian refugees who were resident in Syria before the revolts of 2011 and the war and the conflict that took place, many of whom became refugees for the second or third time in Lebanon or in Jordan, but most of whom have not been allowed access to the kinds of services that the Syrian refugees have been allowed. Because they say, okay, Palestinians are UNRWA's responsibility. UNRWA was able to take in and include some of them in their basic services like education, but not too much else. They don't really have much service. So they've kind of fallen through the cracks in between the Syrian refugees, the Palestinian refugees already in Lebanon, and an international community that kind of pretends they don't really exist. And I get to the last point here, and I think I'm going to finish before my 5 minutes are up, that Syria is a very good example of the larger question that really should loom large over this conference, which is what I asked at the end of the first intro. What does citizenship mean in the context of gross and systematic human rights violations? If a citizen cannot effectively exercise his or her citizenship, cannot access the protection of their state, even when they are still living within the borders of the state, they have not become refugees. Let's say if they become IDPs, or even if they have not even become IDPs, they cannot depend on their state for protection. They must be considered, for all practical purposes, as UN defines it, de facto stateless persons. This is a really frightening question. When you think about so many people living in so many countries where gross and systematic human rights violations are taking place, then the whole question of citizenship and citizenship rights is thrown wide open. I'm sorry to end on such a cheerless thought, but I think this is the question of de facto statelessness should be a topic that we can think about, if not here, but in future conferences. I think I will end here, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and also for shaving off a couple of minutes. Those of you who have questions will appreciate it down the road. Our next speaker is Haki Bahram.
Good afternoon. So I wanted to start my presentation with this quote from a stateless Kurd from Syria, as interviewed in a recent study by an NGO called Syrians for Justice and Truth. This person has been stateless from the moment she was born until today. She has not as yet been able to acquire Syrian nationality. Basically, what she says here points out to the heart of the matter, both to the dilemma of statelessness that we have been talking about since the morning, but also of that of post-statelessness that we do not talk a lot about, but I'm going to talk about. When we think that statelessness is basically solved. And for me, this is something I'll try to briefly talk about here today. And this is something I'm engaging with through my PhD studies on the intersection of the legacy of statelessness, displacement, and identity formation. Now, just to put you in the picture and back to how statelessness was, quote unquote, solved in Syria. Here's a bit of illustration on the situation of how the issues evolved since 1962 with the exceptional census until 2011. Official statistics are, of course, lacking. These numbers that you see here were recently presented in the report I mentioned earlier. For 49 years, this community of Kurds in Syria were left stateless. And under the pressure of a rapidly escalating uprising in 2011 and through a presidential decree number 49, I don't know what's the connection, but it was 49 of 2011, this community was granted Syrian nationality, however, as Arab citizens of Syria, while they are Kurds. Now, receiving, or let's say regaining nationality at a very problematic socio-political moment, Syrian Kurds suddenly found themselves faced with the solution to their statelessness, which came with lots of complications. As you can already detect from the numbers themselves, the issue is far from being resolved. Not only the access to citizenship through granting Syrian nationality was coded within a package then which was named administrative reforms, but also this action by the Syrian government did not aim to bring any justice to the affected people by overlooking the historical injustices inflicted on this community, rather focusing on the act of granting nationality as a generous endowment by the president. Now, some of members of this community spent a lifetime in statelessness. They were born and they died without having a certificate to prove that they existed in this life or that they died. And that's why shortly after Decree number 49 of 2011 was issued, demonstrations in Kurdish populated areas of Syria demanded justice, which according to the demonstrators is not simply achieved by being granted an ID card, which was not free from flaws either, as we'll explain in the next slide. As you can see here, these banners were lifted during the regular weekly demonstrations against the Syrian regime. Although for many persons, receiving nationality was a dream that came true, the nightmare of all the injustice associated with statelessness did not disappear altogether. And this makes us think about what can be considered as the legacy of statelessness now and the whole host of outstanding issues in the post-statelessness time. First of all, as I referred in the previous slide, stateless Kurds who were in the category of Maktumin, the unregistered, were not included in the naturalization decree, although a few managed to change categories and become ajanib, meaning the foreigners. With the hope of benefiting from the decree, many are still struggling with exclusion and their status as Maktumin. Another problem is that of documents issued for ajanib in the past and after the naturalization, which have resulted and still result in discrimination against them. As you can read in some of the codes, this is about the denial of birth certificates and arbitrary age estimation, and all of the other instances of the state's biopower over the body of the stateless person. A recent example is the ID cards issued for ajanib, which are exclusively distinguished with placing number 8 after the registration number. This easily identified mark represents a distinguished branding of the population. And on the part of the naturalized themselves, it represents a persistent fear of being victim of denationalization again, besides the lack of trust in any state procedures in the future. But not only in documents, statelessness has created a stigma that still haunts individuals in their social environments. For many people, what statelessness has left behind is far from being remedied by transitioning into the category of citizens, not being able to marry legally, have children legally, register them legally, are all problems that unfold with the legacy of statelessness post-naturalization. And the same can be said about problems of land and property ownership, which is also another discussion. Sadly enough, though, one can say that a stateless person inherits nothing but his or her statelessness. Adding to this list is all the lost opportunities in life, especially the right to education. Even those who managed to gain education or who could flee outside the country, they were trapped in a vicious circle of having to prove their connection to Syria and that their education was gained in Syria for it to be considered, while at the same time not possessing any documents to prove that, as in the case of Maktumin. So being trapped here, this speaks to a broader issue of identity and belonging, which I study in my research. But before talking about that, for me, the uncomfortable question that remains is basically, has the problem been solved? Well, I guess it depends on how to answer this question. What I can say is the transition from stateless to citizen did not necessarily foster inclusion. Rather, it sustained statelessness and the stratification of it among legal categories, as our previous panelist also referred to. So one has to transition from a stateless maktoum to a stateless ajnabi in order to be considered for naturalization under decree number 49, and to eventually become Syrian, but Syrian Arab citizen. Second, the naturalization decree refused to recognize that those who were included under its provisions were Syrian Kurds. This is also part of the Syrian constitution, that Syria is an Arab country. Moreover, this decree did not refer in its text to any form of compensation, whether material or spiritual, and it did not refer either to procedures for maktoumin and ajanib in the diaspora in case they want to correct their legal status. For me, I take these issues as a research mission in my PhD, where I look at how this legacy of statelessness intersects with displacement and conflicts of identity and belonging. Now, focusing on the transition and post-statelessness, my aim is to explore a more comprehensive understanding of statelessness and its legacy, highlighting the problems of naturalization and acquisition of legal citizenship when they are seen as solo solutions and responses to statelessness. However, being ambitious about that, like any other research, I'm met with a set of theoretical and methodological challenges, starting with how to understand statelessness, how statelessness is conceptualized, understood, solved, whether in law and policy, in discourse, in academic research, in data, or as it's experienced by the stateless themselves. In my case study, this also involves the choice of terms and concepts, which I think they are very important. Whether to talk about stateless or denationalized population. Or should we be talking about ineffective citizenship more than we should be focusing on the legacy of statelessness? Adding to this is the challenging research context with the complexities related to the Syrian case. The unresolved conflict, the absence of transitional justice, the conflicted relationship between the Syrian state and its Kurdish population, as well as displacement and temporalities. Now, why I'm mentioning these challenges, not because they are only research challenges for me as a young researcher, but I think they exist at all levels of engagement with statelessness in the Syrian context, whether we are researchers, activists, advocates, or decision makers. And to be able to better meet these challenges, we need to remember to expand our lenses beyond legal advocacy, although it's important. But we need to expand our lenses to look at statelessness and its legacy as political and structural issues as well. Such issues require comprehensive and humanitarian solution. As UNHCR would put it, that we need to draw attention to the human face of statelessness. I will add to that and say that we need to refrain from seeing access to citizenship on its own as the magic solution that will end all the problems of statelessness. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much for that very thought-provoking analysis. Haki, we now have Martin Kletterbach on the practical challenges and obstacles faced by Syrian refugees.
Great, thanks very much. So I'll focus less on the different categories of citizenship in Syria and more on the practical challenges that we see on a daily basis. The major question being the ability to prove your nationality, prove your identity. And I'll focus mainly on undocumented children, birth certificate cases. And I'll really focus on the field work and the work we see on a daily basis through our programs in Lebanon, in Jordan, and to a lesser degree in Iraq as well. So a bit of a statistical overview of some of the challenges and a tour of the region, some of the real issues. But first, a couple of basic principles. As has been noted by the panellists, nationality in Syria is really patrilineal, so it really depends on proving the existence of the father, the whereabouts, the identity, the nationality. It's really key. In cases where the father is missing, presumed dead perhaps, it's extremely complicated for the widow to take the necessary steps to obtain a birth certificate for their child. Secondly, the most important documents to prove legal identity in Syria are the nationality ID card, the national ID card, and the family book. To be included in the family book, you have to have a birth certificate. To get a birth certificate, your parents have to be married. So you can already see the recipe or the complex configuration of issues that need to exist before you can obtain your legal identity. Syrian law also requires that life events which take place outside of Syria be registered in accordance with the laws of the country where the event took place, as is the case in many countries. So births, marriages, deaths have to be registered in accordance with the laws of the host country. But then also registered with the Syrian embassy within 90 days, or the closest Syrian embassy to the country you're in, or they can be registered in the civil registry in Syria, the Nafus, with the original or a certified copy as well. So that's the basic principles. Then in relation to the practice in the region, Jordan, one of the challenges for a lot of Syrian refugees in Jordan, many refugees have lost their Syrian identity documents. They don't have anything. They've lost them in the conflict, crossing the border. They've crossed the border unlawfully in some cases. Documents have been confiscated upon arrival by Jordanian authorities. They don't have anything. So that's a challenge. Jordanian authorities can't issue Syrian ID documents, obviously. But the government has been more flexible in allowing documents, alternative documents, such as UNHCR asylum seeker certificates, to be used as a kind of a proof of nationality, a de facto proof of nationality, which is one good practice. Many children born in Syria were not registered before fleeing to Jordan, and again, the Jordanian government can't issue birth certificates for children born outside of Jordan. What they can do is issue paternal ratification orders in the courts, where the courts can look at the evidence and they can make an order which is valid within Jordan that the child has certain parentage. Only less than half of Syrians have their marriage certificates in Jordan, 40%, 47%. This is based on research that we conducted earlier this year and last year together with UNHCR. And another feature of the situation in Syria is a lot of marriages take place informally, orphy marriages as well. They're often not registered at all, or they're not registered till later, till there's a need to register them, basically. And finally, children of child marriages cannot be registered, and this is a particularly sad example, I think, where the marriageable age in Jordan is 18, but you can still have an earlier marriage from the ages of 15 to 18, 16 to 18, approved by the Chief Justice of the Sharia Court, but under that age, the marriages are not valid. Unfortunately, we do see cases of girls coming in who are under the age of 15 with children. It's impossible for that child to be registered in the name of the mother, really. So people take all sorts of measures to have the children registered in names of other people, which you can imagine the complications that will result in down the track. And our estimate is that approximately 7% of Syrian refugees in Jordan have no identity documents at all, of which the majority are children. Moving on to Lebanon, it's more complicated than Jordan. There's a 4-stage process to obtain full birth registration, which requires getting a birth notification from the hospital or the midwife, getting a stamp from the local muqtar to approve that notification, going to the civil registry to have that registered, the nafus, and then registering that certificate with a foreign registry. they're the 4 steps. And there's the additional requirement of registering the birth with the Syrian embassy for those who choose to do so. The majority don't. But there's also another linked problem in Lebanon, which is the difficulties with getting legal residency. So estimates are about up to 73% of Syrian refugees, 73%, are not legally resident in Lebanon, which has major implications on their ability to move freely, to go to the offices. So the Lebanese government has said legal residency for the parents is not a prerequisite to getting a birth certificate. That's great, but you still have to get to the office. You still have to get past the checkpoints. And there are cases of people being detained for periods of time without legal residency in Lebanon, which costs about $200 a year. There are some concessions and exceptions which have been made by the Lebanese authorities, but they don't apply to a lot of Syrian refugees. So then we can see the percentage of people who have children who have the notification, which is high, 98%, that's great. But then it moves down to 40% registered with the Nafus, which moves down to only 21% registered with the Lebanese Foreign Ministry, which also raises the question, which we ourselves yet don't have the answer to, of what degree of proof will Syria accept? Will Syria accept just the birth notification if someone were to cross the border, or will they really require registry with the Lebanese Foreign Ministry? And if that hasn't taken place, what will happen? If someone's crossed back into Syria, it'll be extremely hard for them to get back into Lebanon. So there'll have to be a solution found. So the estimate we have is about 79% of children don't have sufficient birth registration up to this 4th level, which could be a big problem. Iraq, as almost a footnote, because there's about 254,000 Syrian refugees in Iraq. They're mainly Kurdish, and they're mainly in the Kurdish region of Iraq, up in the north. And there don't seem to be, from our work, there don't seem to be too many problems with registering the births. There's a smaller category of Syrian refugees in the south, in Anbar, on the border, in a place called Al-Qaim, which is right on the Iraqi-Syrian border, of Syrian women who fled across into Iraq, married Iraqi men. Those men are now deceased, about 1,000 widows. They have children who are of Iraqi nationality, because again in Iraq, nationality typically comes from the father. But they can't prove the death of the husband. They can't prove the marriage, often has taken place informally, and this area was under ISIS control for many years. So it's really hard for them to obtain a birth certificate for the child. They can't go back into Syria on account of the conflict, and because they can't really move back across the border without a birth certificate for the child or an identity document for the child. So they're kind of stuck in limbo. A bigger issue in Iraq, which is not just really related to Syrian refugees or these children, is that a recent report that we've put out also estimates that about 45,000 plus Iraqi children are refused birth registration on account of the alleged affiliation of the parents with ISIS or allegations like that. So the law in Iraq is not just that you have a right to a legal identity, but it's an obligation on the Iraqi state to provide you with a birth certificate. So it's really tough for these children to have no ability to even go to the court and to obtain any proof of their legal identity or their Iraqi nationality at all. Deprives you of health, education, everything. So that's a bit depressing. So maybe now onto a more solutions-focused slide, which is the approach we're sort of taking to try to narrow down the categories of undocumented children in Jordan anyway, and help as many obtain their legal identity as possible. So we went through the database, and over the last 2 years, we've had about 8,000 or so undocumented children approaching us, or the parents. About 48%, or about half, have managed to obtain their birth certificates. We're left with a residual caseload of about 4,200. And then we've sort of broken down the different reasons and the categories for why they're not able to obtain their status at the moment. So there's those born in Syria, those born in Jordan. Of those born in Syria, you can see that 76% don't have proof of the parents' marriage. So that's the major problem there. So in those cases, we really have to go to the Jordanian courts and apply for a paternal ratification order, which could be the solution. I mean, there's complicated situations where the father is missing or not around, because the courts do require some proof, but there's a pathway. In relation to Jordan, there's children who are less than 1 year old and who are more than 1 year old. If you're not registered and you're more than 12 months old, you have to go to court, which is an extra challenge. For those less than 1 year old, the majority do have proof of marriage, but you can see down the bottom there's 50% of the marriages have been conducted informally. So we have to sort of regularise that situation. And then you can see on the children that are more than 1 year old, 58%, there's no proof of marriage. So moving on to some recommendations, which I suppose are fairly generic. Of course, it's important that the host authorities, host governments, streamline and simplify the process for the issuance of the birth certificates, one. Secondly, the amnesties and concessions that have been made by the governments, Lebanon and Jordan particularly, are extremely welcome. They both issued amnesties on regularisation of informal marriages and for children who've turned more than 1 year old, which is a fantastic initiative. Thirdly, confirmation of identity using alternative methods when necessary, when possible, when there's no other documents. Fourthly, a flexible approach to the registration of birth by Syrian authorities, because the majority of Syrians are not able to register the births within 90 days as required by law. And lastly, which others have noted as well, for women to be able to pass their nationality to children as per past resolutions of the Arab League as well would make a massive difference considering the high number of widows in the conflict. So, thank you.
And I'm sorry to be imposing these drastic time limits, but it's also that you can ask more questions and get more wisdom from our panelists. We now have Bernadette Habib, and Bernadette, you'll speak about the changing law and policy environment in Lebanon.
Good afternoon. So I will be talking about the advocacy on statelessness in Lebanon before and after the Syrian crisis. First, let's start with the quick introduction about statelessness in Lebanon. We have thousands of stateless persons in Lebanon. We don't have statistics. This is unfortunate. The last universal census in Lebanon took place in 1932. But we estimate the numbers between 50 to 60,000 stateless persons, excluding Palestinians and stateless migrants and refugees, excluding Syrians, of course. Why we have stateless in Lebanon? We have two main reasons for statelessness. We have the lack of civil registration, which was the subject of a lot of discussions this morning. And we have historical reasons related to the establishment of the state of Lebanon and the establishment of the Lebanese nationality. The main categories of stateless in Lebanon are the historic ones. We have the Bedouins, we have the Dom, or known as Nawar in Lebanon, and we have the Ottomans of Lebanese and non-Lebanese origins who were living in Lebanon since centuries. As for those administrative stateless, we have those born to Lebanese fathers and Lebanese or stateless mothers, but not registered. The children are not registered. We have those born to stateless persons, born to Lebanese grandfathers, and the birth of the children is not registered. We have those born to Lebanese men married to migrant domestic workers, because to be able to register a child in this case, the mother should be living in Lebanon regularly. So if she is in a regular stay, the marriage and the birth cannot be registered. We have the children born out of wedlock to a Lebanese parent, although in this case the Lebanese father or mother can pass the nationality to the child. A lot of people are not doing this, either they don't know or because of the social stigma of having a child out of wedlock. And we have those born in Lebanon to foreign parents who are living in irregularity, such as Syrians before the exceptions given to Syrians. We don't have a legal framework for statelessness in Lebanon, and as a result, the stateless persons have no special legal status in Lebanon and are not recognized by the Lebanese state as stateless. We don't have a legal document saying this person is stateless. And as a result, we don't have a public policy on the matter. What we are doing on statelessness, our advocacy is focusing on prevention, reduction of statelessness, and protection of stateless persons. We work on reducing stateless cases, preventing statelessness at birth, and ensuring universal birth registration, propose and advocate for law reforms, especially gender discrimination and nationality laws, and to facilitate access to nationality to end statelessness. We work on identification, determination of stateless persons, granting documentation and legal status, and ensure protection of stateless persons and access to rights. And these items, as you know, correspond to the action points of the Global Action to End Statelessness adopted in 2014. What we have done so far, Frontiers is today the only NGO doing advocacy and legal aid on statelessness in Lebanon. We have a working group on statelessness with 5 relevant ministries: the Ministry of Interior, of Justice, Social Affairs, Higher Education, and Public Health. This group discusses global policy on statelessness and access to solutions and rights for stateless persons. We did a lot of capacity buildings with authorities about statelessness, access to solutions, access to rights, how they can facilitate the daily life of stateless persons and their access to solutions. We did a lot of dialogue with various actors, including the academia, the media, the local authorities, the health sector, and all those who are somehow working with stateless persons on the ground. Hello? Okay. And we are trying to engage the media as much as possible to build more awareness on this. As for reduction of statelessness, we tried and we have 17 strategic cases in the courts, strategic litigation, to try to change the laws, or at least to change the interpretation of the laws by the courts, and to engage the judiciary in changing the laws at the long term. And we have a litigation for 78 court cases, and we are trying to do awareness for reduction of statelessness through individual and group counseling to stateless persons. And in 5 years, we helped more than 2,500 beneficiaries to reduce their statelessness. And we are trying to do a regular dialogue with the judiciary, as the judicial solutions are the only available ones today. So we are doing a dialogue with the judiciary to ease the judicial process for stateless persons. Yalla, yalla. Hello? Okay. Already? Oh, no. Please. Okay. Okay. So concerning the prevention of statelessness, we are doing a lot of group counseling with stateless persons and with people at risk of statelessness to prevent the statelessness as much as possible. We have published a lot of tools, manuals, leaflets, audio and video tools, and we have proposed a modern and universal birth registration system that was discussed with the Lebanese ministries. We reached nowhere so far, but we are still trying to do something, and we are doing a lot of awareness with people on this. Yalla, I'm trying to go fast. If this works, is this counted? Okay. Okay. We are doing a lot of advocacy for policy change through the working group and through law proposals on nationality, civil registration, and civil marriage. A lot of conferences with authorities, embassies, and actors to reach a policy change one day. And we had published the first study on statelessness in Lebanon. And today we are working on another study on problems to access solutions. Okay, Okay. You can read these reports and appeals, blah, blah, all the tools that can be used for advocacy for change through locally and internationally. Access documentation. We have the only database on stateless persons in Lebanon. It's our own database. It's not, of course, a national database, but it has around 5,000 stateless persons registered in this database. And we have unpublished field study that we are using today in all our initiatives, advocacy initiatives, legal aid, and other. Okay. Moving to Syria, please. Okay. As for the protection of stateless persons, we are working with the authorities, as I said, to facilitate their access to rights. I don't know why it's not working. Hello? Hello? Okay. This one is not working, so I will use my papers. Not to respond. Okay, thank you. Okay, so what changed with the Syrian crisis in this field, despite the positive decisions that were taken in favor of Syrians in terms of civil registration, and these positive decisions were the exemption of residency condition, as I said, to be able to register marriage or birth for a foreigner person in Lebanon, they have to be legally resident in the country. For the Syrians, they were exempt of this condition to facilitate the access to vital events registration. And for the documentation requested for Syrians, they accepted exceptional documents as well, other than those requested from other foreigners in the country. And finally, Syrians were given 2 years grace period to be able to register all vital events, birth, marriages and birth, administratively, even beyond the 1 year delay. We have a delay of 1 year to be able to register with the civil registry. After the 1 year delay, you have to go to courts. Syrians were given a 2 years grace period to do the process administratively. Despite these positive decisions did not affect any other stateless persons in Lebanon, including other migrants who were not exempt or given any grace period, and we were advocating for this with the Lebanese government so far to no end. Okay. As such, there were no policy changes, and the influx did not change our work on the statelessness in Lebanon. The main impact was negative so far, I'm sorry to say it, is that, for example, donors shifted all their programs to humanitarian rather to legal aid to Syrians or to Lebanese. And the host communities did not benefit of this. Yes? Okay. So the programs targeting Syrian refugees and host communities, when they exist, do not include stateless populations in the host communities themselves. So they did not benefit of these. Opportunities and the challenging. The opportunities are that more NGOs today are trying to get involved in the subject of statelessness, especially on birth registration, but we have concern about the approaches and methods and how these approaches and methods will reach to ending statelessness or preventing statelessness one day in Lebanon. There are some efforts to establish a regional network led by the University of Boston, and this is a good opportunity that we will try to invest to do something about statelessness in the country. Today, it seems that, I don't know why, there is a vague of submitting a lot of project laws related to statelessness in Lebanon. Yalla. Okay. Maybe this is due to the high-level meeting on statelessness and the need to present some positive initiatives in the country. But we have a problem with all these proposals that they do not include stateless persons per se. Stateless persons, it's not clear how stateless persons would benefit from these proposals, what documents are needed, how they can reach these solutions. Okay. And of course, there are a lot of proposals relating to the right of women to pass nationality to their children. Again, those born to stateless fathers and Lebanese mother are not included literally in the proposal. Challenges. The first challenge is when Syrians want to return to Syria, what about children who are not registered? What would be their status in Lebanon? What would be their status in Syria? What would happen regarding their nationality? There is a lot of racism towards Syrian refugees today in Lebanon, and this is affecting, not only may affect, this is affecting the stateless populations in Lebanon because Syrians are mostly living in communities where stateless people used to live. And the political environment today resulting of the Syrian conflict is making our life harder because it is almost unthinkable to advocate for ratification of international conventions on statelessness and for legal reforms. It's ended? Okay, thank you. On time?
Yes, we're on time. It's a real problem having to cut somebody off who's got so much interesting things to say, so many interesting things to say. Our final speaker is Thomas Magee, and you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. So firstly, I'm very happy that I can build on everything that my fellow panelists have already covered. As you can see, the title of my presentation today is Vulnerabilities in Displacement, Stateless Syrians. And I'm focusing particularly on the practical challenges within the European context. So this presentation really draws on the field research that I conducted as part of the Stateless Journeys project run by the European Network on Statelessness and Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion. And that project is a platform, as you can see on the website, focused on the relationship between statelessness and forced migration in Europe. Its aims are to generate an evidence base and tools for advocacy, capacity building, awareness raising, and community engagement, all with the greater aim of protecting the rights of stateless refugees. So within this context, it had become evident to all involved when the initial discussions were taking place about the research that we were going to conduct, that statelessness was generally very underappreciated as a concern within migratory and especially asylum contexts. There was relatively little attention being given to stateless refugees within the research that was taking place. This was particularly critical during the increased when there were increased numbers of asylum seekers and refugees arriving to Europe from 2015, particularly through the Mediterranean corridor. We saw that overall, 3% of asylum applications that were recorded during 2015 and 17 were by individuals who were recorded as stateless, of unknown nationality, or of Palestinian origin. And within this broader context, the fact that Syria was the country of origin for the largest number of the asylum seekers and refugees across Europe every year consecutively since 2013, in addition to our awareness that of the several statelessness issues within Syria pre-conflict, as mentioned by other speakers, we decided to focus our research on two particular profiles of stateless persons from Syria, namely the stateless Kurds, as Haki's already covered, and Palestinian refugees from Syria. So since we've already had some background on those two communities, I'm going to focus particularly on the challenges and obstacles such individuals faced within Europe. So firstly, from many of the interviews, we saw that there was a lot of cases of misidentification of statelessness. In general, there was a lack of standard policy across the European reception states when it came to identifying statelessness. Then discrimination, both institutional and on the level of individual officials. We saw many cases of limited freedom of movement, particularly on international borders. For example, moving between Greece and Macedonia, many stateless Syrians were stopped at the borders while Syrian citizens could continue. Obstacles to family reunification. Here, I'm going to talk about it at length later, so I'll just highlight it now. And then exclusion from resettlement. So some resettlement schemes focused explicitly on Syrian nationals or Syrian citizens, some implicitly so. And then also there were cases where, particularly with Palestinians registered under UNRWA, it was effectively very difficult for them to access the resettlement schemes led by UNHCR. Okay, so now I'm going to give you some of the testimonies that we received from the interviews to highlight some of the challenges and obstacles faced. In many cases, there were commonalities of experience that came through these interviews, and generally around the perception that statelessness had increased the vulnerability of the individuals in question. So let's begin with Lana, a stateless Maktouma Kurd from a small village in northeastern Syria. Just adding the names are pseudonyms here. So this quote is quite a long quote, but it's stressing here some of those issues around identification. So she explains how the municipality here in the Netherlands was asking her repeated questions about her passport, a lack of passport, her various, what they saw as abnormal documentation issues. She says, I tried again to explain my story and show them these documents. After multiple attempts, and this going on for several months, somehow her situation stabilized and it seemed there was some understanding. But then as she highlights right at the end, she was surprised that this was ever an issue since she was admitted into the country based on her father already being here, who is himself stateless. So in the last sentence, she says, I don't understand why it was so confusing for them that I was too. Okay. Now, let us, one point going that relates to what Haki was saying, particularly for Maktoumin from Syria, there was generally a wide perception that all ought to have been naturalized within the decree from 2011, while as Haki stated, this is not the case. Now, Mazen is another case, this time a Palestinian refugee from Syria. He took a flight to Turkey, moved with relative ease by sea, well, relative ease, had a capsized boat, but got to Greece. From Greece, he encountered a number of difficulties that we'll see on the next slide. So here he talks about how the Greek police stopped him at various points, essentially with the misunderstanding about the fact that there are actually Palestinians from Syria. So he talks here in the last sentence, they were holding me at the border and not letting me cross, saying Syrians only. When he finally got to the Netherlands, and many of the cases that we looked at were connected to Netherlands being the final destination country. So his challenges when he got to the Netherlands didn't end. So here he was similarly asked to prove his statelessness and to prove that he is a Palestinian refugee from Syria. In order to do so, he presented various documents. He presented his Syrian residency document for Palestinians. He presented his Syrian travel document for Palestinians, his Syrian driving license, his military book from Syria, his education certificates from Syria, all in the original, and the photocopy of his UNRWA family card. The Dutch authorities then told him that he had to present the original of the family card, despite the fact that the family card is issued for the family, and his relatives who had stayed behind in Lebanon were using it to receive assistance. He was, as a result, registered as of undetermined nationality and has spent the last 2 years trying to change that status. If we can move on to the last case, this is Nareen and Rashid, who are, again, we're going back to the stateless Kurds. They are Makhtoumi Kurds from Syria. And while two of their family members, Nareen and Rashid, also traveled through Greece back in 2015, while the borders in Europe were relatively open. They arrived quite quickly to the Netherlands and submitted a family reunification claim, as did many other Syrian refugees from Syria at the time. From then until now, they've struggled through a labyrinth of bureaucracy, logistical issues, and legal issues across Syria, Lebanon, and the Netherlands, involving many NGOs and legal assistance providers across that pathway. So their biggest obstacle was simply to prove the family connections that they had and to demonstrate that they are, in fact, relatives. As Martin mentioned, Syrians in general would demonstrate this through the family book. As Makhtoumi Kurds, they don't have access to a family book, so they struggle to prove it that way. They were ultimately requested by the authorities to attend a DNA test at the embassy, the Dutch embassy in Beirut. This, however, was quite a challenge, given that they live in the most northeasterly part of Syria, so they had to travel across the entire country in order to attend the appointment. And as you can see here, it's a challenge that's ongoing, and they are still struggling with the process. So I'll leave it there. I think I'm running out of time, but I'll just leave you with this long quote.
Thank you. That's my stuff. Thanks. Those have been some very rich and I have to say depressing presentations. Lots of problems, few solutions. And I think if I can summarize, I've been given 3 to 5 minutes to summarize, but you don't need to hear from me. You want to ask questions. I think the biggest summary that I can come up with is, number one, gender discrimination, i.e. women cannot pass on their citizenship. Number two, bureaucracy, failing to appreciate either the lack of documents or being unable to understand the ones that they have. And number three, more bureaucracy in trying to solve the actual issues as presented. I don't know if that's a fair summary. And then also, of course, failure to understand history in the region that leads to some of these problems. And then finally, a failure to understand the social, psychological, human, and humanitarian impact that the lack of the right paper at the right time can have on individuals and families. Have I got that right? I think so. The floor is open to questions. Yes, please. And there is a wandering microphone.
My name is René de Groot, Maastricht University. Thank you very much for this very good, all these very good presentations, which indeed makes one a bit depressive together with the refugees. I want to make one point, which was mentioned in the first presentation. In the first presentation, at the end, it was said, we have to recognize that all these people living in refugee camps are de facto stateless. And I would like to put a question mark with that suggestion. Both in the UNHCR and in the Council of Europe, we had long discussions about this distinction between the jure statelessness and de facto statelessness. And at the end, the UNHCR and the Council of Europe stressed very much that the qualification de facto statelessness doesn't bring anything, because international law does not provide facilitations for those who are recognized as de facto stateless. And both the UNHCR in the handbook on statelessness and also in documents of the Council of Europe, the tendency is to say that either we have to help people to get their nationality recognized, but with the Syrian refugees, that does not bring them so much at the moment, or we have to stretch up a bit the concept of the jure stateless. And I think that is the best way to go, to rethink when somebody can be recognized as de jure stateless. And perhaps we have to say that if a group of people are sitting very, very long in refugees camps, that there is a moment where we have to say, we have to recognize them as de jure stateless, with all the consequences. Thank you.
I don't think there was a question there, but if anybody wants to respond to that comment. And I certainly, as a failed international lawyer, I think I'm inclined to agree with you. If you cannot avail yourself of the protection of a state, then as you said, originally, what does it mean? So refugees prima facie have no protection of the state. But if anybody wants to comment. Fateh?
Yeah, I agree with you fully. I agree with you fully with what you're saying. But the problem there, of course, is that the international community doesn't have a means to deal with what de facto statelessness means. So it's much easier and much better and more cleaner, if you will, to be able to say, okay, we have now judicially determined a de jure statelessness situation, and then we have ways in international law to deal with it. The problem, of course, is, going back, and I was actually referring not just to the refugee communities, but even people living within their own countries. The fundamental question about what citizenship means in terms of accessing the protection and services of your state. And that is a huge problem. I don't have solutions for it. I'm not suggesting that calling them de facto stateless is going to change anything in terms of the rights, but at least maybe recognizing it might spur some action towards better institutionalization of the protection of rights. Whether we're talking about them as human rights, and human rights and citizenship rights largely overlap, with very few exceptions, really. And if we do that, then maybe we're on the way to finding some very specific things that we can do that are based in international human rights law, for example, as well as in governance questions and in development questions and all of that.
Yeah, I think the distinction might be access to rights versus access to services. I mean, most states grant rights based on territorial presence, but services based on paperwork. In the last row, black shirt, please.
Hello, I'm Christoph from the Peter McMullen Center on Statelessness. Perhaps a question to Haki and Thomas. You mentioned the situation of the stateless Kurds in Syria and how there was initially the belief among the European authorities that the situation has been resolved. I'd be interested if in your research it came across how knowledge and decision makers are circulating. Each of the individual national decision makers making their own research into these situations, or are there being facts gradually established and then they circulate? Are these institutions exchanging knowledge? I would be really interested in that. And the second question, Thomas, you highlighted this example with the family from UNRWA issued family book. Is there no data exchange from UNRWA to these decision-making authorities that they can make requests and UNRWA would simply have the data and could share them with them? Thanks.
Yeah, is this working? Yeah, so I don't really know much about if this information is getting to the authorities that need them on the European level. I am based in Sweden, and what I can say about the situation there is that the migration board, when they study cases of asylum, they usually do it case by case. Although there is like decision not to deport anyone to Syria, still now there are tendencies to study their cases individually, and I think when it comes to a stateless case, then that will be an individual case. Unfortunately, I don't see there is a lot of information that finds its way to the decision-making bodies on the situation of Makhtoumeen, for example, in Syria. As long as the naturalization decree has been passed since 2011, the impression is that statelessness is solved in Syria and anything else is just something new, perhaps. I think that was about how knowledge is disseminated. I'll leave Thomas the next one.
Sure. Similarly, to build on what Haki's been saying, I've worked as a Syria country expert for a number of cases in the UK, and repeatedly it's the exact same issue and the same question coming up. And it seems that there's very little basis in terms of country of origin information that is being used within the system before it gets referred to an expert. And also, I've been contacted by a number of different European asylum agencies working on doing their own country of information profiling on this case, and sometimes I put them in contact with the person who asked me the month before. So it doesn't seem like it's very well qualified, very well coordinated, sorry. In terms of the UNRWA card, it's something that we were asking on about with this particular case, because it had in other cases in the Netherlands, other Palestinian refugees from Syria had been able to fill out a form in order to get UNRWA to confirm that they were indeed registered as a PRS within their database. It really seemed to depend upon the local municipality within the Netherlands and what they required. This one was just insistent that the original hard copy had to be put in front of them. And the lawyer has contacted UNRWA, got various statements, completed I think it's the tracing form, and to no avail. They are waiting. To the end, I think it's been shipped out, the card, and is going to be shipped back.
Oh, yes. First, the gentleman in the printed shirt there.
Yes,
Thank you.
two very quick questions. My name is Edwin Abuya from the University of Nairobi. The first is to Haki, but it also touches on Thomas's presentation on the presidential directive. Haki, what motivated that directive? And Thomas, you mentioned at the tail end of your presentation that it's not been implemented. I'm just curious to know how come a presidential directive is not implemented. The next is to Martin. At the very tail end of your presentation, you talked about the Arab Declaration. And I'm just wondering what's the status of that declaration in the country that you mentioned on. Is it implementable? Is it not implementable? Thank you.
Okay. So it might be the same response. But yes, in 2011, there was a presidential decree to naturalize one category. As was mentioned previously, there were two categories of stateless Kurds within Syria. There were the Ajanib, the foreigners, and then the Makhtoumeen. That decree in 2011 explicitly covers the Ajanib al-Hasaki is the full title, and makes no reference of the Makhtoumeen al-Qaid, the second category that's generally seen as a lower class of stateless person with even lesser rights. So they were explicitly excluded from the decree. Also, as I think Haki mentioned, those who were already out of the country couldn't access the provisions of the decree.
Yeah, and just a quick follow-up. So the thing about statelessness in Syria, it was not only one phase of statelessness. So as Thomas said, we had Ajanib and Maktoumeen, and sarcastically enough, to be Ajanib was to have more privilege as a stateless person than to be Maktoum, because at least as an Ajnabi you have the red card, which will facilitate your life to a certain extent if you compare your life with a person who has just the white card as a Maktoum. As a holder of the red card, you had a registration number. You could go to the office and get some sort of documentation, however, as a foreigner, not as a citizen, but that privilege, if you call it privilege or not, was not existing for Maktoumeen. And yes, the nationalization decree only covered Ajanib, not Maktoumeen.
All right, the young woman in the middle.
Sorry, just my name is Elsa. I work with UNRWA in Lebanon. I just wanted to clarify one thing on the exchange of information. It's done on an individual basis where judges or lawyers would reach out to our offices and ask for specific individual cases, not on family book, to fill out a document, and then we can confirm whether they were registered with us or not. When a person is still in the region where UNRWA is operational, we're talking West Bank, Gaza, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, they fall under the protection of UNRWA. Once they're outside of those areas, they fall under the mandate and the protection of UNHCR. So that's also, once they are going to Europe, or they end up in Europe, they fall under the protection mandate of UNHCR, which is also quite an interesting sort of difference between various mandates. But there comes the struggle sort of when they come back to UNRWA to ask specific registration and asking whether Palestinians from Syria fall under the UNRWA protection mandate. For us, it's quite challenging to explain the difference. And it also depends on the lawyer and the judge. So when that specific judge wouldn't reach out to us or the email sort of gets lost, then of course the response doesn't come either. So I just wanted to clarify that. And maybe one other thing is that the Palestinians, refugees from Syria in Lebanon, it was said that they fall between the cracks, but I just wanted to also state again that they fall under the UNRWA mandate and they are receiving the services, education services, health services, and in many of the cases we've seen that we advocate for them to benefit from the same positive developments that are taking place for Syrian refugees. So once we saw that the legal residency was no longer linked to civil registration, this also positively impacted the close to 30,000 Palestinian refugees that we still have in Lebanon. Thank you.
Thank you. We have room for one more quick question. Yeah. Oh, yes, of course. Yes. Yes. Sorry.
The answer to the question on the Arab Declaration is very easy. No, no progress. But you know, Syria is not the only country in the region that has a patrilineal approach as well. And unfortunately, you know, the signs are that things are getting tougher, more conservative, not more progressive in Syria in relation to laws affecting women.
Maybe to close out the session, since I didn't see any eager hands, I want to give each of the panelists one chance to... Was there one that I didn't see? Okay, a little one. All right, one little one, and then every panelist gets 1 minute to make one final remark.
So I'm Drury. I work with a Bahrain-focused NGO. I mean, statelessness is one of many problems in this region that we're talking about. If, from a statelessness perspective, if you could change one thing in a context of what ultimately is war, what would it be?
That sounds like the good question for the entire row.
I'm still thinking. Okay. So we're talking regionally now, or okay? Ooh, well, beyond Syria.
Just to mention this, there's a professor at Beirut University, Bassel Salou, who says, advocates a one big, the grand bargain. Iran, Saudi Arabia, U.S., Russia.
They are saying you have to.
There's a professor at I think at Beirut University, Bassel Salou, who's advocated a grand bargain approach. Get the Russians and the Americans and the Iranians and the Saudis to all meet and actually thrash it out. Good luck. Yeah.
Okay, I mean, for me, ideally, I would say the step should be to eliminate gender discrimination, but knowing how difficult that is, I would say focusing on ways to foster solidarity between different affected groups across the region is something that practically we can collectively work on.
One thing, it's very difficult to choose one thing. I think I'm hesitating between either choosing ending the old and prolonged cases of statelessness that are historically and are being inherited by the children, or preventing new cases. And I think I choose the two, sorry. And we have to work on both, on ways and measures to prevent new cases, and at the same time on how to reduce the old cases.
I can't even think in terms of grand bargains in relation to Syria. So I'll agree with what Thomas has said and take it one step further. I would also advocate for children to be able to have a legal identity regardless of the marital status of the parents.
I think what I want to address is the elimination of identity discrimination in the Middle East as a whole, and to recognize that the Middle East is a region of fake nation states.
Can we start with the Gulf? Yeah, it's really an almost impossible question to ask, because fundamentally, it's not about, I don't believe in grand bargains, because once you do get into grand bargains, then you're getting into power discussions and power decisions on that affect people's lives. I would try and think of a bottoms-up approach, which is what they tried in the revolts of 2011, which are still in a way going on in Sudan and Algeria right now. I think the combination of the solidarity idea and the strengthening and the support for people's power that enforces governance that is institution-based and rules-based rather than, mood-based, which is a grand bargain on its own. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Fateh, Haki, Martin, Bernadette, Thomas. That's been fascinating. The one thing that you did